So, how can you save data in your Flutter app even if it's sensitive? My name is Dan, I'm a mobile software engineer here at Wolfpack Digital, and today we're going to see how to do that while also respecting some clean code practices. For start, we have here a Flutter project. It's the basic project that gets generated if you just create a new project from Android Studio. And what I did as a preparation is just you can see here on the right side on the simulator, usually the Flutter project that is generated just has this plus button which increments a counter, and the only thing that we have in addition to that is another floating action button with the minus icon here, which decrements the same counter. You can see here in the code, as we have the increment counter that's generated, I also created a decrement one and put these floating actions in a row so they are next to each other. But the thing is that if you restart this app like that, the counter will reset to 0. So first things first, let's see how we can save the value of this counter even if the app gets restarted. So how can we persist it locally? For that, on native apps like on Android or iOS, we could use shared preferences or NS user defaults just to save simple data like strings or integers or simple values. In Flutter, we have something similar. We have a library that's called shared preferences. Alright, and this says that it wraps platform specific storage, user defaults for iOS, and share preferences for Android, like I just said. So we could use this package. It's pretty simple to use, and for installing it, all you have to do is just take this share preferences dependency and add it to our Flutter project. Let's do that right away. Alright, let's run pub.get to get the dependency. Alright, and now let's see if we can use it in code. Another thing that I did is just to move the UI code from this main Dart file, move it to a separate file called home screen, but it's basically very similar to what the project generated. So let's see how we can use the new package that we just added. Alright, we already have shared preferences here. This get instance function that returns an instance of preferences is asynchronous. So we have to convert our function to an async one, and then we can use the shared preferences object here. Now, the natural way would be to continue to code here and use this solution to save when we increment the counter and when we decrement the counter, just to save the new value. But if we need to change this dependency in the future for some reason, which we will see by the end of the video, then it would be complicated, because if we use it directly like this in code, we would need to go to every class in which we used it and change it, let's say with a different library or a different dependency, and that is not very easy to do after the project gets bigger. So what we can do instead is to create an abstraction layer, and Dart has this really cool thing called a mixin, which we'll see in a moment. Let's call it persistence service. Alright, and we can declare a mixin like that. A mixin is sort of a class that can be associated to other classes in order to reuse pieces of code. So whatever we declare here in the mixin, we can declare some functions, which we'll see in a moment. All these functions will be available to the class that gets extended with the mixin. And how can we do that? We just write here, let's say we want the home screen class to get the behavior from the persistent service mixin. We just say with persistent service, like that. And we don't need to, we can delete this dependency, shared preferences, because we won't be using the shared preferences dependency here directly. Instead, we will create everything that's related to shared preferences here, and in our code we will just use the persistent service mixin. And this will allow us in the future to change maybe from shared preferences to another library and only do code changes here, while the rest of the code remains untouched. Okay, so in this mixin, what we want to do in our case is just to save this int value that we have on the screen, and of course to read it when the app gets relaunched. So we'll need two functions for that. Let's start with the save function. So save counter. Of course we'll need the counter value here. Alright. As we saw earlier, if we are gonna use shared preferences, then we need to make this function asynchronous, and let's say prefs. Okay. So now we can use this preferences instance to save our integer value, like that. Set int. We'll need a key, let's say counter, and the value is counter value. Okay, this is also asynchronous, so we will use the await keyword. For a better code, to make this even better, we can save the key as a constant. So we have counter key equals counter, and we just use the counter key here, like that. Okay, so this will just save our value, and we need another function to read it. So this will return not an int but a future of int, because as we already saw, these operations are not synchronous. So we have get counter. Again, the shared preferences instance, and we can already return preferences and look for the counter key. Okay. Yep. In case the value does not exist, as you can see here, then we need to have some kind of fallback, and we can return just return 0 and start from scratch if this does not exist. So as you can see, we already have the home screen associated with persistent service, but actually, since our logic is in the state, we'll need to use it on the state. So let's move that here. Alright, we have the persistent service, and now after incrementing and decrementing the counter, the first thing we need to do is to save it. And now when we increment or decrement the counter, what we also need to do is to save the new value of the counter, like that. So now when we increment or decrement the counter, besides the UI changes, we will also save the value on the disk. The problem is that when we restart the app, the counter is still at 0 because we didn't read the value anywhere yet. So if we do that, we'll complete the whole cycle. And let's do that using init state. When the state is initialized, we can call the get counter value. Since this is a future, because it's an async function, we have to use then, and when the future is returned, we just set the counter to the saved value, to the value that our future returns. Now we can restart the app. We need to restart it from scratch, and we will see how it works. Alright, we have the app restarted. Let's increment and decrement the counter a few times. So, okay, we'll leave it at 6, and now let's restart the app. The initial value for a brief second was 0. Let's see that again. And that's because we are initializing the counter with 0, and only when the future returns, we get the saved value from shared preferences. But if we change that and restart the app again, we can see that the new value is persisted same if we decrement it. Okay, so first of all, this is a simple way to save strings, integers, and simple data on the disk, so they get saved between different launches of the app. But then comes the situation where you need to save maybe some data that's a bit more sensitive. I don't know, maybe some username or some personal details that you don't want to be exposed to potential security problems. So for that, we have another good package on Flutter, which is called Flutter Secure Storage. And how we would do this natively in iOS and Android would be by using the keychain and encryption on using key store on Android, and this package is based exactly on that, on the keychain and on AES encryption with a key store in key store. Okay, so as we saw in the beginning of the video, we have this persistent service layer that allows us to change the dependency quite easily. And if we want to switch to Flutter Secure Storage, we just get, first of all, we get the dependency here. Alright, and now, just like we used shared preferences, we can switch to Flutter Secure Storage, to the new one. And in order to do that, let's stop the app, because we will need to restart it anyway. Instead of shared preferences, we can do the following. Let's have, since we will reuse the same instance, let's just have it here as a final storage is an instance of Flutter Secure Storage. So after declaring this Flutter Secure Storage instance, we can use it here in the mixin to save or read our data. And to do that, we have this function, it's called write. And a downside of this package is that you can write only string values. So in our case, if we do that, if we try to write the counter value, it will say that int cannot be assigned to string. So we have to do a workaround for that and transform the int value to string when we save it and also when we read it. So in this case, we can just simply use the string and it will convert it to string. And then to get the value, we have storage read we use the counter key, and this will be let's call it counter as string, because it's a string value. Okay, and you can see actually it's a future because it's an async function. And if this returns null, then we can just assign it to 0 like that. Now we can just return int, and you can just parse this string. Of course, in real life applications it would be better to check if the parsing works and catch some errors, but for this example our focus is on seeing how to save data in a Flutter app, so we won't do extra checks for the parsing right now because we only save this counter value here. Okay, now in theory we already replaced the dependency, and of course this means that when we run the app we'll start again from scratch. But here, as you can see in the home screen, nothing has changed. We have the same save functions and get the save counter and get counter functions, and you can just run the app and see how it goes. Okay, we are back, and we can see that the new value is again at 0 because we started with the new library and we don't have any saved values yet. Let's increment the counter and decrement it a bit, and now restart the app. As we can see, it's working like before. Even if we increase and decrease it again, we restart it for a brief second at 0, but then it reads the value. As you can see now, it's from this Flutter secure storage instance, and it gets persisted between restarts of the app. So the key point here is, first of all, pick your dependencies wisely. If you need to store just some simple data, you can use shared preferences, but if it's a bit more sensitive, then Flutter secure storage is a better option because it's more secure on the native side. So I would recommend you to use that. And of course, whatever library and solution you're using, it's always a good idea to create an abstraction layer and put everything that's related to that dependency in that layer. So if you want to change it in the future, you don't have to modify the code in your entire app. You just change the necessary layer and that's it. Okay, this is it for this Flutter tutorial. I hope that you learned something new and useful, and we'll see you again in another Wolfpack Digital tutorial pretty soon. Have a great day.